What happens when military experts scoff at new technology, only to see it change the course of history? Imagine a weapon so advanced, so innovative, that it is dismissed by high command and laughed off by soldiers on the front lines. Yet, this very ammunition, initially ridiculed as impractical and ineffective, would go on to become one of the most decisive factors in the war's turning point. How does something so groundbreaking face such ridicule? How does it transform from mockery to a game-changing force? The story of experimental ammunition is a tale of risk, revolution, and unexpected triumph. In the heat of battle, every weapon is tested, but not all weapons are created equal. This particular ammunition wasn't born from traditional military doctrine or standard issue requirements. It came from the minds of innovators who dared to dream beyond the familiar. It promised to revolutionize combat, but the road to acceptance was anything but easy. At first, no one could have predicted its impact. Soldiers, accustomed to the tried-and-true methods of warfare, didn't know what to make of it. The ammunition was unlike anything they'd seen before, heavier, more complex, and far more powerful than the standard rounds. Yet, the skepticism was palpable. High-ranking officers who had fought wars with traditional methods viewed it as an unnecessary risk. They saw no reason to deviate from what had worked in the past. After all, the principles of warfare had remained largely unchanged for centuries. But in war, tradition is often the first casualty. Behind the scenes, a few brave individuals continued to push for this new ammunition despite the overwhelming doubt. They believed in its potential to change the very nature of battle, but convincing others seemed impossible. It was an uphill battle, facing not only external resistance, but also the weight of institutional inertia. The military, by nature, is built on trust in the tried and tested. Why take a gamble on something that no one was certain would work? Then came the moment that would alter everything. A pivotal battle, one where the conventional weapons would not suffice. This ammunition, which had been the subject of scorn and derision, would finally be put to the test. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The outcome of this conflict could shift the tide of war, but only if this new technology could prove itself. What happened next would astonish both the skeptics and the believers. The experimental ammunition, once dismissed as a novelty, began to show its true potential in the heat of combat. The results were nothing short of miraculous. It was a turning point, not just for the battle at hand, but for the future of warfare itself. The soldiers, once doubtful, now stood in awe, as the ammunition did what no one thought possible. It penetrated enemy lines with precision, cutting through defenses that would have otherwise been impenetrable. The new rounds brought a deadly efficiency that couldn't be ignored. Soon, the ammunition that had once been laughed at was the very key to victory. What had started as an idea dismissed as unfeasible had now become the weapon of choice. The innovation was no longer just a breakthrough in ammunition, it was a revolution in the making. As the dust settled after the battle, high-ranking officials took note. The ammunition that had once been mocked was now celebrated as a decisive force in the war. Its effectiveness was irrefutable. What began as skepticism had transformed into overwhelming respect. In the days that followed, the ammunition became a core part of the military's arsenal, influencing every operation that followed. The world of military innovation is often one of slow adaptation, but sometimes, just sometimes, the right idea comes along at the right moment and everything changes. The ammunition, once thought to be nothing more than a passing fancy, had turned the tide. It had proven the doubters wrong, and in doing so, It had rewritten the rules of warfare. Do you want to see how this experimental ammunition continued to shape the outcome of the war? The world of military technology is one that evolves slowly, methodically, and sometimes begrudgingly. But every so often, there arises a breakthrough, a shift in the fabric of warfare that changes everything. The dawn of experimental ammunition was just that. A glimmer of possibility that many could not see at the time, but which would later prove to be a pivotal moment in the course of history. In the early days of the war, military forces relied heavily on conventional tactics and weapons. Bullets, bombs, and artillery, simple and effective. They had been used in virtually the same form for decades. But as the war intensified and the enemy adapted, the need for new solutions became more apparent. It was clear that the traditional methods weren't enough to guarantee victory anymore. Enter the innovators, a small group of military scientists, engineers, and visionaries who believed that technology could push the boundaries of what was possible. These individuals understood that ammunition, the very lifeblood of warfare, had to evolve. But like all great innovations, their ideas were not immediately embraced. In fact, their work was met with resistance. After all, what need was there for new ammunition when the existing weapons had always worked? Why risk the unknown? Yet they persisted. These pioneers of experimental ammunition sought to create a round that would deliver greater power, accuracy, and versatility. They worked tirelessly, testing different formulas, materials, and designs. Each failure, while discouraging, brought them closer to the breakthrough that would change the war. They knew they were onto something big, but convincing others was their real challenge. The idea wasn't just to improve upon existing ammunition, it was to revolutionize it. The goal was to create something that could penetrate deeper into enemy defenses, deliver more powerful strikes, and offer a level of precision that traditional weapons simply couldn't match. They envisioned ammunition that could change the course of a battle with a single shot, that could give the soldiers on the ground a new advantage that could make all the difference in the world. It wasn't easy, though. The military leadership was wary. Experimental technologies were often viewed with skepticism, and for good reason. Many had failed in the past, wasting precious resources and manpower. But these innovators were determined to prove that their new ammunition could be a game. They understood that in times of war, sometimes taking risks was the only way forward. The early tests were a mix of successes and failures, but each test brought them closer to their goal. They faced countless setbacks, stud rounds, misfires, and yet they kept going, driven by the belief that what they were developing could turn the tide of war. They knew that victory wasn't just about sheer force. It was about the edge that technology could give them on the battlefield. Then, after countless trials, they had a breakthrough. The new ammunition, what had once been mocked as an untested idea, proved itself in a series of trials. The rounds were more powerful, more accurate, and faster than anything the soldiers had used before. It didn't take long for word to spread, and with it, a wave of skepticism began to turn into interest. What had been ridiculed was now seen as the future of warfare. The question, however, remained: would it hold up under the most intense conditions? The true test would come on the battlefield, where the stakes couldn't be higher. As the war raged on, the newly developed ammunition would face its first real challenge. Would it perform as promised, or would it fall short? Just another failed experiment in the history of military innovation? This was the turning point, the moment when the world would learn whether the dream of experimental ammunition would become a reality or fade into obscurity. The next step would be crucial, getting it into the hands of the soldiers who needed it most, and proving that sometimes the boldest ideas are the ones that change everything. Would you like to see how this experimental ammunition performed in real battle? Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next. As with any innovation, there is always resistance. The military, by nature, is a conservative institution. It thrives on tradition and methodical processes that have stood the test of time. When a new idea is presented, especially one that challenges the status quo, it is met with suspicion, skepticism, and even hostility. And so it was with the experimental ammunition. The engineers and scientists behind the new ammunition believed they had created something revolutionary. They knew that their product could be the difference between victory and defeat, especially as the war intensified and old strategies seemed less effective. But getting their invention into the hands of soldiers on the front lines would prove to be far more difficult than they had anticipated. The military high command, composed of seasoned officers and commanders who had fought in countless battles, saw little need for such drastic changes. In their eyes, the existing arsenal of weapons tried, tested, and reliable was more than enough to win the war. Why risk introducing something unproven when the current methods had served them so well? It was also the matter of tradition. Ammunition had been refined over decades, even centuries. The very concept of experimental rounds, particularly ones that challenged the established understanding of ballistics and weaponry, was met with disdain. To many in the military, it seemed like a foolish gamble, one that could potentially backfire and waste precious resources that could be better spent elsewhere. But it wasn't just the ammunition itself that raised eyebrows, it was the individuals advocating for its use. These were not the battle-hardened veterans commanding troops in the field. They were scientists and engineers, many of whom had never seen combat. To the generals and high-ranking officers, these civilians seemed out of place in the war room. Their technical expertise, valuable in its own right, but irrelevant when it came to the realities of combat. The military believed that what worked on paper didn't always translate well to the chaos and unpredictability of the battlefield. The tests, too, didn't help matters. Early trials of the ammunition were far from flawless. There were misfires, inconsistencies in performance, and, of course, the inevitable failures that come with any experimental technology. The ammunition couldn't yet prove itself under the pressures of real battle, and this only added to the doubts of the high command. In some cases, officers were outright dismissive, dismissing the new ammunition as nothing more than a distraction. "We have no time for pipe dreams," they would say. "We need proven, reliable weapons, not newfangled ideas that could get us killed." For those advocating for the ammunition, this resistance was maddening. They had seen the potential. They had witnessed the ammunition's success in controlled environments, and they knew it could change the tide of the war. Yet, without the approval of military leaders, there was no way to get it into the hands of those who needed it most. Despite the skepticism, there were a few forward-thinking commanders who believed in the potential of the new ammunition. They argued that, in a war of such magnitude, it was essential to push the boundaries of technology and strategy. While many of their peers were hesitant, these commanders understood the necessity of taking risks, especially as the war began to turn in unexpected directions. However, they were fighting an uphill battle. It would take much more than a handful of enthusiastic supporters to overcome the ingrained resistance within the ranks. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, and despite the best efforts of those who supported the new ammunition, its implementation was delayed time and time again. The opposition wasn't just about the ammunition itself, it was a battle of philosophies. On one side, There were the traditionalists, clinging to the methods that had worked in the past. On the other, there were the visionaries, who knew that victory in this war would depend on the ability to adapt, to evolve, and to innovate. The question remained, could the new ammunition overcome this opposition and prove its worth? In the brutal theater of war, would it be able to gain the trust of the military establishment, or would it remain relegated to the realm of unnecessary experiments? What happened next would astonish everyone and completely change the way warfare was waged. Would you like to know how this ammunition proved itself in real battle? Let me know if you want me to continue with the next step. The moment of truth had arrived. After weeks of skepticism and resistance, the experimental ammunition was about to face its first real test in the harshest environment possible, the battlefield. The military had finally agreed to give it a chance, albeit begrudgingly, and now it was time to see whether the ammunition could live up to its promise. The test would take place in the midst of one of the most critical battles of the war. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the ammunition failed, it would be written off as just another failed experiment, another idea that looked good on paper but couldn't survive the brutal realities of combat. But if it succeeded, it could change the course of the war and solidify its place in military history. The soldiers who were selected to use the experimental ammunition were a mix of eager volunteers and reluctant participants. Some of them had heard rumors about the ammunition's potential and were curious to see if the hype was justified. Others were more cautious, having seen countless new technologies come and go without making any real difference. Regardless of their stance, everyone knew that this was a pivotal moment. As the battle raged on, the first signs of success or failure began to appear. The ammunition was put to use in a variety of scenarios, from long-range engagements to close-quarters combat. Soldiers fired their weapons with a sense of anticipation, wondering if the rounds would perform as promised. At first, the results were mixed. The ammunition didn't always deliver the accuracy or power that had been claimed. There were still issues to iron out, and many of the soldiers began to question whether they had been sold a false bill of goods. The ammunition didn't seem like a game changer. It seemed like just another weapon, no different from the others they had used. But then something unexpected happened. In the heat of the battle, when everything seemed lost, the experimental ammunition began to show its true potential. Soldiers found that the rounds were more effective at penetrating enemy armor than anything they had used before. The ammunition had a remarkable ability to hit targets with pinpoint accuracy, even at longer distances, and the destructive power of the rounds was far greater than what anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just the soldiers who noticed the change their enemy began to take notice as well. What had once been a steady line of defense began to crumble under the force of the new ammunition. The tides of the battle shifted, and for the first time, the soldiers using the experimental rounds found themselves gaining the upper hand. The skeptics, who had once dismissed the ammunition as a worthless experiment, were forced to confront the reality of its effectiveness. High-ranking officers, who had been critical of the new technology, now found themselves praising its capabilities. What had once been seen as an untested, unproven weapon was now a decisive force in the battle. The success was not without its challenges. However, there were still some flaws to be addressed, and the ammunition wasn't perfect. But the key takeaway was clear. The ammunition had the potential to change the course of warfare. It was no longer just an idea, it was a proven asset in the fight. The real test, however, was yet to come. The experimental ammunition had proven itself in one battle, but would it stand up to the test of time? Would it continue to perform under the pressure of prolonged combat, or would it prove to be a fleeting success, doomed to fade into obscurity. One thing was certain. The world had just witnessed a turning point in military history. What had once been mocked was now a weapon of unprecedented power, and its place in the future of warfare was all but guaranteed. Would you like to know how this ammunition continued to shape the outcome of the war? Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next topic. The moment had arrived. What was once a dubious experiment was now being tested under the most intense conditions. The initial success of the experimental ammunition had been a pleasant surprise, but the real test was whether it could hold up in the long-term struggles of warfare. The battle was far from over, and this ammunition would have to prove itself over time. As the days went on, the new rounds began to take on an increasingly crucial role. What had been a one-time test now became an essential part of the soldier's toolkit. The battlefield, a place where failure could mean life or death, had become the proving ground for a technology that no one had believed would succeed. And yet, against all odds, it began to show just how vital it truly was. One of the most telling moments came during a fierce counteroffensive. The enemy had regrouped, launching a series of well-coordinated attacks meant to reclaim the territory that had been lost. The odds were stacked against the soldiers who had been using the experimental ammunition. They were vastly outnumbered, and the situation seemed dire. The weapons they had used before had failed to stop the enemy, and there were few alternatives left. But the experimental ammunition began to shine. With precision and force that no one had predicted, it tore through enemy lines. Tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry alike began to fall before the new rounds. The soldiers, once hesitant to fully trust the ammunition, now found that it was their best chance at survival. This shift in momentum was nothing short of dramatic. The enemy, confident in their advantage, was now on the defensive. They had not expected the unexpected. This new ammunition had upended their strategies. It was a revelation to both sides. What had once been dismissed as a fluke was now clearly a decisive weapon. At the heart of the success was the ammunition's ability to adapt to different situations. It was versatile, equally effective in long-range engagements and close-quarter battles. The power of the rounds, combined with their precision, allowed soldiers to take out targets that would have previously been impossible to hit. The ammunition didn't just perform well under ideal conditions, it exceeded expectations in the chaos of real combat. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this turning point was the psychological impact it had on both the soldiers and the enemy. For the soldiers using the ammunition, it was a moment of redemption. The weapon they had once mocked, the one that had been ridiculed and dismissed, was now their greatest ally. They had witnessed firsthand the power of the ammunition, and it gave them the confidence to push forward. For the enemy, however, the ammunition's effectiveness was the surprise of its performance was not just a tactical shock, it was a psychological blow. The enemy forces had counted on their established strategies, their overwhelming numbers, and their superior firepower to carry the day. But now they faced an unforeseen threat. The battle that had once seemed like a foregone conclusion was now in doubt. The war was far from over, but this moment, the moment when the experimental ammunition proved its worth, marked a definitive shift in the conflict. What had started as a risky experiment, an idea met with skepticism, had turned the tide. The ammunition had not only proven its worth, it had proven to be indispensable. This success would reverberate through every corner of the battlefield. The leaders who had doubted the ammunition's potential were now forced to reckon with its power. The soldiers who had once feared it would fail now saw it as their greatest weapon. And the war, which had seemed to be slipping away, now had a new hope. The experimental ammunition had already defied expectations, but the true scope of its impact had yet to fully unfold. What begun us a seemingly marginal innovation, had now proven itself time and again under the most grueling conditions. Yet, even the most optimistic proponents of the new technology hadn't predicted just how dramatically it would change the course of the war. In a decisive battle that would go down in history, the ammunition played an even more unexpected role. The soldiers had been pushed to the brink, facing overwhelming odds, with the enemy's forces poised to break through and gain crucial ground. Every standard strategy had been exhausted, and the situation seemed grim. The battle had reached a standstill, a moment where the outcome could have swung in any direction. Then something incredible happened. As the enemy advanced, the soldiers using the experimental ammunition fired with a precision and force that was previously unseen. In the midst of a relentless counterattack, the new rounds cut through enemy defenses like a hot knife through butter. What had once been a line of seemingly impenetrable forces crumbled under the onslaught. The sheer effectiveness of the ammunition left both sides in stunned silence. For the soldiers, it was a moment of victory, but also one of disbelief. How had this new technology, one that had once been the subject of mockery and ridicule, become the key to securing victory in such a critical battle? It wasn't just about the ammunition's physical power. It was about the psychological effect it had on everyone involved. For the soldiers on the front lines, the new ammunition gave them something they had desperately needed. Hope. The constant struggle, the mounting casualties, the unrelenting enemy attacks, they had all taken a toll. But now they saw a glimmer of possibility. They saw that victory, once thought to be unattainable, was within reach. And it was this ammunition, this once dismissed experimental round, that had made all the difference. The unexpected success of the ammunition rippled through the ranks. The soldiers began to believe in it wholeheartedly. The skeptical officers who had once doubted its effectiveness now found themselves advocating for its widespread use. What had started as an experiment, a risky gamble, was now seen as a proven asset, one that could turn the tide of the war. But it wasn't just the soldiers who were stunned by the results. The enemy, too, felt the weight of this unexpected turn of events. The battlefield had always been a place of calculated risk, but now the enemy faced an unknown variable, one that they hadn't been prepared for. The once predictable nature of combat was now disrupted by the power of this new ammunition, and the enemy forces were left scrambling to adapt. The ammunition's success was a testament not just to its technical prowess, but to the courage and innovation of those who had fought for it. It had proven that sometimes the most unexpected solutions are the ones that change the course of history. What had started as a simple experiment had evolved into a weapon capable of altering the outcome of a war. In the wake of this victory, the ammunition's reputation grew exponentially. It was no longer seen as just a novelty or a fluke. It was now a cornerstone of military strategy. The soldiers who had once been uncertain about its capabilities now regarded it as their most valuable asset. The ammunition, once dismissed, had become a symbol of innovation, resilience, and the power of experimentation. But even as the battle raged on, the question remained: could this success be replicated? Was this ammunition truly the answer to all of their problems? Or was it just another weapon that had found its moment of glory? The coming days would reveal whether the experimental ammunition could continue to deliver on its promise, or whether it would ultimately be a fleeting success in a long and brutal conflict. The victory brought by the experimental ammunition had already altered the course of one key battle, but its impact didn't stop there. What had once been a tool of last resort became a central piece of the military's arsenal. As the ammunition proved itself time and again, it began to influence not just the equipment used by soldiers, but the very tactics they employed on the battlefield. In the days following its initial success, military strategists and commanders began to reassess their approach to combat. The ammunition had done more than just break through enemy lines. It had opened new avenues of tactical thinking. It allowed soldiers to strike with greater precision, and it had the ability to take out high-valued targets that would have once been considered untouchable. Its effectiveness wasn't just in its firepower, it was in how it reshaped the way battles could be fought. Before the introduction of the experimental ammunition, military tactics followed a familiar rhythm. Armies would set up their lines, position their weapons, and wait for the enemy to attack. Defensive strategies dominated, and success was often measured by how well one could hold a position or push forward in traditional, slow-moving combat. But with the ammunition now playing a central role in their operations, soldiers began to see how they could push past traditional strategies. They realized that they could take a more proactive approach, using the ammunition's precision to strike key targets before the enemy could react. This shift led to more aggressive and fluid tactics, where speed and unpredictability became crucial assets. One of the key changes was in how soldiers approached fortifications. Previously, when faced with enemy strongholds, the only real option was to launch a prolonged assault, slowly breaking down the defenses with sheer force. But the experimental ammunition offered a different solution. Now, soldiers could strike at the heart of enemy fortifications with pinpoint accuracy, eliminating critical components before the enemy had a chance to respond. In essence, the ammunition didn't just change the nature of the weapons themselves. It changed the way soldiers thought about warfare. The idea of waiting for the perfect moment to strike was replaced by a sense of urgency. They didn't have to wait for the enemy to come to them. They could go on the offensive, making the first move with deadly precision. The tactical advantage was no longer just in numbers or brute force. It was in the ability to outsmart and outmaneuver the opposition with the right tool at the right moment. This shift in thinking had a profound effect on the battlefield. No longer were soldiers reliant on waiting for the enemy to make the first move. They now had the ability to dictate the tempo of the battle. The ammunition's introduction allowed them to fight smarter, not harder. It was no longer about trying to break through walls. It was about finding the weak spots and exploiting them. The impact on command strategy was equally significant. Officers who had once adhered strictly to traditional tactics now began to incorporate the use of the ammunition into their plans. No longer did they only rely on infantry advances or artillery bombardments. Instead, they began to coordinate specialized units equipped with this new weapon, sending them behind enemy lines to target vulnerable points and disrupt the enemy's operations before they had a chance to regroup. But this change wasn't just tactical, it was psychological as well. The enemy, who had once relied on conventional strategies, now faced a new kind of threat. They couldn't predict when or where the experimental ammunition would strike next, and that uncertainty created a sense of fear and unease among their ranks. The psychological advantage it provided their soldiers using the new ammunition was immense. The enemy had no way of knowing when they would be hit, and that unpredictability gave the forces using the ammunition a significant upper hand. This shift in tactics and mindset marked the beginning of a new era in warfare, one in which technology was no longer just a tool to aid soldiers, it was a weapon in itself. The experimental ammunition had proved that with the right innovation, even the most entrenched military strategies could be turned on their head. But as the tide of war shifted in favor of the soldiers using this new weapon, the question remained: Could this tactical revolution be sustained? Would other technologies emerge to challenge the dominance of the experimental ammunition? Or was it the start of a new chapter in military innovation? As the experimental ammunition continued to prove its worth on the battlefield, one of its most unexpected and significant effects became clear: the psychological impact it had on the enemy. In war, it's not just the physical weapons that determine victory. Often, it's the mind games, the uncertainty, and the fear that can break an enemy's resolve. And in this case, the new ammunition did just that: created a psychological weapon so powerful that it altered the enemy's entire approach to combat. Before the introduction of the new rounds, the enemy had been accustomed to their own standard tactics. They knew the strengths and weaknesses of their weapons and soldiers, and had learned to predict the moves of their opponents. They felt confident in their established strategies, relying on overwhelming force and numbers to carry them to victory. But suddenly, they were faced with an enemy who had an unexpected and previously unthought of advantage. The experimental ammunition, with its precision and power, changed everything. The enemy forces were accustomed to dealing with traditional weapons, which had their limits. They had developed strategies to overcome these limitations, usually by outnumbering or outmaneuvering their foes. But now, with this new ammunition in play, they were confronted with a weapon that could hit targets with devastating accuracy from further distances, piercing defenses they thought were secure. This was no longer just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one. At first, the enemy didn't know how to react. The new rounds caught them off guard, and that surprise began to undermine their confidence. They had been used to fighting battles where they could predict the outcome, but now there was a level of uncertainty. Could they rely on their old strategies? Could they trust their fortifications? Every time they heard the distinct sound of the experimental ammunition strike its target, it planted a seed of doubt in their minds. What else had they not accounted for? Fear began to set in. In war, fear is often just as dangerous as the weapons used in battle. The enemy soldiers started second-guessing their own movements, unsure of where the next strike might come from. The psychological impact was enormous. They could no longer assume that the traditional tactics would guarantee success. Every step they took was now under the shadow of doubt. They feared that the next battle could be the one where their carefully laid plans were shattered by this new and seemingly unstoppable weapon. As the battle continued, the psychological toll on the enemy grew. Soldiers who had once been confident in their superiority began to question their chances of success. Their commanders, who had relied on conventional strategies, began to lose their grip on the battlefield. The uncertainty introduced by the new ammunition had done what no amount of firepower could. It had destabilized the enemy's confidence and ability to make clear decisions. This psychological warfare had ripple effects. The more the enemy hesitated, the more difficult it became for them to maintain their aggressive stance. Units that had once been able to push forward without fear now found themselves holding back, unsure of what the next move would be. Their own morale began to falter, and the internal fractures began to show. Leaders who had once been respected were now questioned by their troops, who were uncertain of their safety and uncertain of their ability to lead them to victory. The enemy began to react in ways that were uncharacteristic. They became more cautious, more hesitant. The psychological pressure of facing a weapon that they couldn't predict or fully understand caused them to fall back on their old tactics, the ones that had worked in the past but were no longer as effective. The fear of being outmaneuvered by an unseen force made them hesitant to take the initiative. And in war, hesitation can be deadly. As the tide of battle shifted, the soldiers who had once been under constant threat began to experience a sense of confidence. They could feel the change in the air of the enemy, was no longer the monolithic, seemingly unstoppable force they had once been. The experimental ammunition had leveled the playing field, and the soldiers using it knew they now held the upper hand. With every strike, they grew more assured of their ability to break the enemy's will and force them to retreat. The ammunition had become more than just a weapon. It had become a psychological advantage that changed the dynamics of the entire war. It wasn't just about the power it delivered. It was about the fear it instilled in the enemy, the uncertainty, the hesitation, and the psychological pressure it caused ultimately led to the enemy's downfall. As the experimental ammunition continued to demonstrate its effectiveness on the battlefield, it became clear that its impact was not just temporary or confined to a single battle. The introduction of this new ammunition marked the beginning of a paradigm shift in warfare, a new era where innovation and technology would play a decisive role in determining the outcome of conflicts. The success of this ammunition was the first step toward a future where new weapons and strategies would constantly reshape the landscape of war. The traditional methods of warfare, while still effective in certain contexts, had begun to show their limitations. The battlefield was changing rapidly, with new technologies constantly being developed to provide soldiers with an edge. Ammunition, in particular, had remained relatively unchanged for centuries. But this new type of round, initially met with skepticism, had proven that innovation could break through the constraints of tradition. The ammunition's versatility played a significant role in its success. It wasn't just effective in one-on-one combat or long-range engagement. It had the ability to adapt to different scenarios, from close-quarters battles to precise strikes against heavily fortified positions. This adaptability made it an indispensable asset for military strategists who saw in it the potential for a complete overhaul of their combat strategies. In the months following its success, military leaders began to incorporate the experimental ammunition into their standard operating procedures. What had started as a controversial and untested innovation soon became a key component of military doctrine. Training programs were developed to ensure that soldiers could maximize the ammunition's effectiveness, and specialized units were created to take full advantage of its capabilities. The success of the ammunition wasn't just limited to its immediate impact on the battlefield, it also set the stage for future innovations. Engineers and military strategists began to realize that the principles behind this ammunition could be applied to other areas of warfare. New types of explosives, firearms, and even vehicles were developed with similar innovative thinking, aiming to achieve the same level of precision, power, and adaptability. As these technologies advanced, the nature of warfare itself began to evolve. The focus shifted from sheer firepower to strategic, tactical, and technological superiority. The experimental ammunition had demonstrated that in modern warfare, success wasn't just about having the most soldiers or the largest arsenal. It was about using technology in ways that could outsmart and outmaneuver the enemy. The ammunition's success also had a profound effect on the psychology of war. Soldiers began to understand that the key to winning wasn't just about holding a position or overwhelming the enemy with numbers. It was about the ability to make decisive, well-timed strikes with the right tools. The ammunition had become more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the future of warfare, that valued precision, innovation, and the ability to turn the tide of battle in a single moment. For the enemy, this new reality was disorienting. What had once been a war of attrition, of pushing forward with overwhelming force, was now a war of precision and technology. The traditional methods that had worked for so long were no longer enough. The experimental ammunition had opened the door to a new kind of conflict, one in which the advantage was no longer solely in numbers, but in the ability to adapt and innovate. As the war continued, the lessons learned from the success of this ammunition would influence not just the outcome of this conflict, but all future wars. The impact was far-reaching, setting the stage for an entirely new generation of military technology and tactics. What had begun as an experimental round had evolved into a symbol of progress, a harbinger of the new era of warfare that was now on the horizon. The introduction of this ammunition had marked the end of an old way of thinking and the beginning of a new, more technologically advanced approach to combat. It had proven that, in the world of modern warfare, innovation was not just an advantage, it was the key to survival and victory. Would you like to see how this new era of ammunition continued to shape the course of history? Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the final topic. As the war continued to unfold, the once mocked experimental ammunition had solidified its place as one of the most decisive weapons in the arsenal of military forces. What had begun as an innovation met with laughter, skepticism, and disbelief had, in a matter of months, turned into a game-changer and instrument of victory that shaped not only the outcome of battles, but the future of warfare itself. The ammunition had proved itself in countless engagements, each time delivering results that surpassed expectations. What was initially dismissed as a risky gamble had become a cornerstone of military strategy, a symbol of innovation and resilience. It wasn't just the soldiers who used it who marveled at its power. It was the generals, the tacticians, and the commanders who had once doubted its potential, now fully aware of the transformation it had brought to the battlefield. This shift wasn't just about the ammunition's technical specifications. It was about a new way of thinking. The introduction of this weapon heralded a shift from traditional methods of warfare to one focused on precision, adaptability, and technology. The success of the ammunition had opened the door to new possibilities, new strategies, new tactics, and new innovations that would continue to evolve long after the war ended. For the soldiers on the front lines, the ammunition had become more than just a tool. It was a symbol of hope, a belief that even in the darkest moments, innovation and ingenuity could turn the tide. It gave them the confidence to fight harder, to believe in their ability to make a difference, and to trust in the new methods of warfare that had emerged from the unliked list of places. But the true victory wasn't just in the battles won or the enemies defeated. It was in the realization that sometimes the greatest advancements come from the most unexpected places. The ammunition, once ridiculed, had proven that even in times of war, when everything seems set in stone, there is always room for progress, for innovation, and for change. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the most radical ideas are the ones that change the world. As the war came to an end, the ammunition that had once been mocked would go down in history as one of the most important technological advancements in modern warfare. It had not only won battles, but had also revolutionized the way wars were fought. It had proven that the future of warfare was not just about firepower. It was about using technology to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the enemy. For the soldiers, commanders, and engineers who had fought for the ammunition's inclusion in the military's arsenal, it was a moment of triumph. They had pushed against the odds, faced ridicule and resistance, and had ultimately succeeded in changing the course of history. Their innovation had become the standard by which all future weapons would be judged. As we reflect on the journey of this once mocked ammunition, we are reminded that the road to progress is never easy. It is paved with doubt, skepticism, and failure. But when the right ideas find the right moment, they have the power to transform the world. The ammunition that once seemed like nothing more than a fleeting experiment had, in the end, proven to be a defining factor in the war and in the evolution of modern military technology. For those who stayed with us through this journey, thank you for watching and engaging with this story. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most transformative innovations in warfare, make sure to hit the like button, comment below with your thoughts on how experimental ammunition has shaped modern warfare. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical content. And be sure to check out the next video on Insert Next Video Topic. It's just a click away.